When most people picture Ferrari, they do not picture a company so much as a feeling. They see a low red machine under Mediterranean sunlight. They hear an engine climbing into a scream that sounds less mechanical than operatic. They imagine speed, wealth, danger, elegance, victory. The Ferrari image arrives all at once, already complete, as if it had always existed that way. As if the world simply woke up one day and decided that this name, this horse, this color, would stand above the rest. But myths are almost never born complete. They are assembled, protected, revised, paid for. They are built from contradictions that people learn not to look at too closely. And Ferrari, perhaps more than any other car maker on Earth, did not merely produce machines. It learned how to turn competition into theater, engineering into identity, scarcity into desire, and vulnerability into legend. Because the real story is not just about beautiful cars. It is about how a company in a shattered corner of post-war Europe managed to make itself feel eternal. It is about how a racing team became a kind of secular aristocracy. It is about the strange relationship between machinery and myth, between precision and personality, between commerce and purity. And above all, it is about how Ferrari convinced the modern world that a car could mean more than transportation, more than technology, more even than luxury. It could mean destiny. That is the deeper question inside the Ferrari story. Not how Ferrari became famous, but how it became sacred. There is a natural temptation to tell the Ferrari story as a clean origin myth. There is Enzo Ferrari, there is the famous prancing horse, there are the first race cars, and then there is the rise to immortality. It sounds neat, it sounds inevitable. It sounds like the kind of story people like to tell once the ending is already known. But the myth was not made in one brilliant act of invention. It was built slowly, through instability, discipline, performance, loss, and repetition. Ferrari did not rise because it made one perfect car, or won one decisive race, or was led by one superhuman founder. The company became what it is because many different forces reinforced one another over decades. Racing prestige created brand prestige. Brand prestige justified high prices. High prices preserved exclusivity. Exclusivity increased mystique. Mystique allowed Ferrari to seem above ordinary market logic, even while it depended on the market more than it liked to admit. And underneath that polished image was something much less serene. Ferrari was, for much of its history, a company living inside tension. It wanted to be a racing team, but needed to sell road cars. It sold dreams of refinement, but was often shaped by brutal internal discipline. It cultivated aristocratic elegance, yet was forged in workshops, risk, grief, and industrial improvisation. It presented itself as timeless, while continually adapting to survive. That is why the Ferrari myth matters beyond automotive history. It shows how some institutions become larger than the products they make. They stop being judged only by what they do. They begin to be judged by what they symbolize. And once that happens, the work changes. The company is no longer only building cars, it is defending an idea. Long before Ferrari became a global symbol of prestige, Italy itself offered the cultural soil in which such a symbol could grow. This mattered more than it first appears, because Ferrari was not born into a neutral industrial world. It emerged from a country where speed, style, craftsmanship, performance, and spectacle already had unusual weight. Italy in the early 20th century was a place where mechanical modernity could be felt emotionally. Machines were not just useful, they could be expressive, they could be beautiful, they could carry pride, ambition, even national meaning. Motor racing in that world was not a sideshow. It was a public drama. It represented danger, progress, masculinity, prestige, and modern power all at once. This was the era when racing drivers were treated less like athletes and more like mythic figures, half engineers, half gladiators, driving fragile missiles through landscapes with almost no margin for error. Manufacturers understood that competition was not merely about proving durability or speed. It was about being seen at the frontier of modern life. Enzo Ferrari came out of this atmosphere. Before he was the architect of a brand, he was a man formed by racing's emotional logic. He had been a driver, a team organizer, a builder of relationships, a keen reader of status and performance. He understood early that the race car was not just a machine on a circuit, it was a narrative device. It created heroes, rivals, symbols, memory. It could transform technical achievement into public myth. This is one reason Ferrari became Ferrari, and not just another manufacturer with a historic logo. Enzo was not simply interested in building cars efficiently. He was interested in creating an entire world around them, a world where victory mattered spiritually, a world where the machine reflected its maker's will, a world where the right result on a Sunday could ripple outward into identity, prestige, and desire. That instinct came before the mature company. The myth did not begin with scale, it began with sensitivity to what racing meant to people. Enzo Ferrari is often remembered in simplified form. The stern founder, the dark sunglasses, the commanding personality, the old-world patriarch. These details are not wrong. They are just incomplete, because what made Enzo so consequential was not merely charisma or stubbornness. It was his ability to organize reality around a single hierarchy of values, and to force everyone near him to live inside it. Racing came first. That was the principle from which everything else followed. Road cars were important, but as a means. Business mattered, but not as an independent goal. Public image mattered, but mainly because it sustained the larger project. Ferrari under Enzo was not constructed like a conventional consumer brand with customers at the center. It was built more like a court around a sovereign purpose. The center was competition, everything else orbited it. This created enormous strength. It gave Ferrari clarity. Many companies know what they sell, but fewer know what they worship. Ferrari worshipped victory, prestige, and technical excellence under pressure. That clarity produced consistency of tone across decades. Even when the company changed, expanded, professionalized, or globalized, the core message remained emotionally legible. These were not ordinary cars because they came from a place where ordinary priorities were treated with contempt. But this same structure also produced fragility. A company centered on one man's obsession can appear coherent from the outside while becoming brittle on the inside. Enzo's severity was part of the legend. Yet it also reflected a system where emotional distance, fear, and relentless pressure were often normalized. Ferrari's history is full of genius, but also departures, arguments, resentment, and pain. And that matters, because myths are rarely made from harmony. They are often made from intensity. The very pressure that produces greatness also narrows what people are allowed to say, question, or become. Still, Enzo understood something many industrialists did not. He knew that authority itself could become part of the brand. Ferrari did not have to seem friendly, it did not have to seem available. In fact, distance increased its power. The company's image drew strength from austerity. To want a Ferrari was to want entry into something selective, demanding, and slightly indifferent to your desire. That is not an accident. That is myth construction. If Ferrari's reputation has a sacred center, it is not the showroom, it is the track. This is the crucial fact. Ferrari did not first become legendary because it sold luxury. It became legendary because it attached itself to the most dramatic proving ground available and stayed there, year after year, through triumph and humiliation alike. In racing, the brand could claim something more potent than beauty. It could claim legitimacy under fire. This mattered especially in the middle decades of the 20th century, when motorsport still carried extreme physical danger and enormous symbolic weight. To race was to enter a domain where failure was public and success could seem almost transcendent. Wins were not abstract. They were witnessed. They were earned under pressure. They left memory behind. Ferrari benefited from this in two ways. First, racing made the company visible. It turned a relatively small manufacturer into a name that traveled through newspapers, photographs, trophies, and conversation far beyond Italy. Second, and more importantly, racing gave Ferrari a moral language. The brand could present itself not merely as expensive, but as proven, not merely as decorative, but as forged through competition. The road car inherited dignity from the race car. This transfer is one of the great moves in modern brand history. The average buyer would never drive at Le Mans, Monza, or on a Formula One grid, but Ferrari made it possible to feel connected to those worlds through ownership, or even through admiration alone. The customer did not just buy a vehicle, he bought proximity to danger mastered by art. Yet this was never a stable formula. Racing is expensive, uncertain, and unforgiving. Victory cannot be manufactured on schedule. Entire seasons can go wrong. Rules change, rivals rise, technologies shift, people leave. Ferrari's myth was not built because it won all the time. It was built because it remained visible enough, proud enough, and emotionally charged enough that even its defeats fed the story. The struggle itself became part of the identity. That is when myth deepens, when success is no longer the only fuel. The timing of Ferrari's rise also mattered immensely. After the devastation of the Second World War, Europe was rebuilding materially and psychologically. Industry had to recover, but so did identity. In that environment, a company like Ferrari could become more than a manufacturer. It could become a vessel for a certain image of Italian excellence, precise but passionate, modern but handmade, glamorous but rooted in local craft. Maranello was not Paris, it was not London, it was not Detroit, and that distance from the centers of financial power helped the legend. Ferrari seemed to come from a place where work still had texture, where engines were not simply assembled but coaxed into life, where expertise did not feel anonymous. This was partly reality and partly romantic projection, but myths often thrive where the two become hard to separate. The world was also changing in ways that favored the company's symbolism. Mass production was transforming everyday life. More people could buy cars. More companies could promise convenience, reliability, and value. Ferrari moved in the opposite direction. It stood for the idea that some objects should remain difficult, specialized, almost unreasonable. In a century increasingly organized around scale, Ferrari made smallness and singularity feel noble. That distinction was powerful. It allowed Ferrari to occupy a strange and enviable position. It was part of the modern industrial world, yet it seemed to stand outside mass-market dilution. It used technology, but did not sound technological in the cold, utilitarian sense. It felt artisanal without being quaint, aristocratic without being entirely detached from performance. And so Ferrari became useful not only to drivers, but to culture itself. The brand gave people a way to imagine that industrial modernity had not fully killed beauty, risk, hierarchy, or romance. It offered proof, however selective, however curated, that machinery could still carry soul. One of the deepest Ferrari paradoxes is this. The company became world-famous through road cars it never wanted to prioritize in the way other manufacturers would have. Enzo Ferrari reportedly viewed road cars, at least in part, as the means of financing the real mission. That attitude helped create one of the brand's greatest strengths. Because Ferrari road cars were not born from a philosophy of broad customer satisfaction. They were born from a culture that regarded compromise with suspicion. The result was often imperfect, sometimes difficult, occasionally temperamental, but rarely forgettable. This mattered enormously. Plenty of luxury products are admired, fewer are revered. Reverence usually requires an element of excess or even inconvenience. A Ferrari did not need to be the easiest car to live with. In some eras, it almost benefited from not being easy. Difficulty became proof of authenticity. The car asked something of you. It required taste, courage, money, tolerance, maybe even submission. And all of this made ownership feel less like consumption and more like initiation. The design language helped too. Ferrari learned over decades how to make the car look like an event even when standing still. Long hoods, sculpted flanks, taut proportions, and a sense of compressed force gave the vehicles visual drama that exceeded practical necessity. You did not have to understand horsepower figures to understand that the object had been composed to provoke. Then there was the sound. Ferrari engines did not merely perform, they announced. That acoustic identity became part of the myth's architecture. The scream of a high-revving Ferrari was one of those rare sensory signatures that could carry brand meaning instantly. Even people with little interest in engineering understood that it signaled something elevated, almost ceremonial. So the road car became a stage on which the company's entire mythology could be condensed into metal, leather, and motion. It was not transportation, it was a portable piece of narrative. One of the most important ingredients in Ferrari's myth was not speed, it was restraint. Luxury brands often say they are exclusive. Ferrari turned exclusivity into structure. The company understood that desire intensifies when access feels limited not only by price, but by judgment. A Ferrari should not feel like something anyone can simply acquire by walking into the right store with sufficient money. It should feel like something granted, earned, or at least filtered. This logic shaped production numbers, dealer relationships, special editions, customer hierarchies, and the broader choreography of access. Scarcity was not a side effect, it was strategic. The brand could have pursued volume more aggressively at various moments in its history, but too much availability would have injured the core illusion. Ferrari's power depended on the sense that it belonged to a thinner air. This is where the myth became especially modern. Because Ferrari was not only making rare objects, it was managing attention. It was controlling who got close, who had to wait, who was seen as worthy, and who remained on the outside looking in. That is a powerful social engine. People do not merely want beautiful things. They want beautiful things that say something unforgiving about rank. And Ferrari's refusal could be as potent as its embrace. To be denied, delayed, or kept at a distance by the brand only reinforced the idea that it sat above ordinary commerce. This can seem arrogant, and often was, but arrogance, carefully managed, can become part of an aura. The company did not need to flatter everyone. In some ways, it was more valuable because it did not. The mythology of Ferrari, therefore, did not rest only on product excellence. It rested on a mastered social psychology. The company knew that desire deepens when the object seems to retain its own will. Every myth needs symbols simple enough to travel. Ferraris became extraordinarily effective. The prancing horse, the yellow shield, the red bodywork that, whatever its complicated historical origins and racing colors, eventually became shorthand in the public imagination for Ferrari itself. These symbols mattered because they allowed the brand's meaning to move faster than explanation. You could glimpse a Ferrari in a film, on a poster, in a child's bedroom, on a magazine cover, and the message arrived before the details did. That is how myth scales, not by remaining nuanced, but by becoming legible from a distance. The prancing horse in particular did something remarkable. It carried motion, nobility, aggression, elegance, and heritage all at once. It was not an abstract corporate shape. It was alive. It suggested power held in tension. Combined with the company's visual language and racing pedigree, it made Ferrari feel less like a manufacturer's mark and more like a heraldic emblem surviving into the machine age. And red, of course, became more than paint. It became drama made visible. The Ferrari red of popular imagination, whether seen on a Formula One car or a road-going Berlinetta, condensed speed into color. It invited the eye before the mind had time to analyze. In a world saturated with products and logos, Ferrari built a system of recognition that felt immediate and almost primitive. This matters because myths survive through repetition, but repetition requires symbols sturdy enough to survive translation. Ferrari could enter different countries, generations, and media environments because its signs were simple, charged, and highly portable. The child who knew nothing of Enzo Ferrari, Mille Miglia history, or V12 engine architecture could still understand that the horse meant something special. That kind of recognition is not decoration, it is infrastructure. Ferrari's rise cannot be understood through engineering and racing alone. The company also benefited from the expansion of image culture, as film, photography, glossy magazines, television, and later digital media grew more powerful. Ferrari became one of the perfect objects for modern desire. It was photogenic, symbolic, and already wrapped in a narrative of status and danger. Cinema helped enlarge the myth, so did celebrity ownership, tabloid fascination, and the broader economy of aspiration that defined the late 20th century. Ferrari was useful to image makers because it could signify many things at once. Wealth, yes, but not merely wealth. It also suggested discernment, virility, competitiveness, glamour, recklessness, or taste, depending on the context. It could appear in stories about ambition or decadence, romance or ego, triumph or downfall. This flexibility made the brand unusually durable. Trends changed, cultural codes shifted, but Ferrari retained its charge because it could be reinterpreted without losing identity. To one audience, it was old-world craftsmanship. To another, it was extreme performance. To another, it was a luxury trophy. To another, it was the nearest thing to a street-legal race car. The core aura remained intact. What is striking is that the company often seemed to understand this without surrendering entirely to it. Ferrari wanted to be seen, certainly, but it also protected a sense that publicity should not define the essence of the brand. That balance was difficult. Too much glamour, and the company risked seeming superficial. Too much engineering seriousness, and it risked losing emotional scale. Ferrari's genius was to live in the overlap. The result was that the car became not just an object of admiration, but a social signal of almost unmatched potency. A Ferrari could be a machine, an artwork, a badge, a fantasy, and a story people told about themselves. Very few products can hold all of that at once. There is another reason Ferrari became mythic, and it is less comfortable to discuss. The company's legend was shaped not only by beauty and victory, but by danger, grief, and sacrifice. Motor racing in Ferrari's formative eras was deadly. Drivers died, spectators died. The line between heroism and catastrophe was appallingly thin. This was not peripheral to the culture, it was central to it. The glamour of racing in the mid-century world was inseparable from its mortality. Ferrari's image, therefore, grew in the presence of loss. This darkened the myth. It gave it gravity. The company did not feel frivolous, even when associated with luxury, because it had been forged in arenas where the stakes were unmistakably real. There was blood in the history, there was mourning, there was the recurring knowledge that speed extracts payment. Enzo Ferrari himself carried personal tragedy as well, including the death of his son Dino, and that sorrow became part of the emotional atmosphere surrounding the company. Not in a neat, sentimental way, more as a shadow. Ferrari often seemed to exist in a tension between ecstasy and mourning, performance and pain. That tension made the brand feel larger than consumer culture. It belonged, at least in part, to the old tragic world. This is important because myth often requires contact with suffering. Without that, prestige can remain shallow. Ferrari's history contained enough risk and loss to make its triumphs feel costly. Success was not clean. It was wrested from instability, sometimes from heartbreak. The company's aura of seriousness came partly from that burden. Of course, danger also became commodified. Later generations could consume the image of risk from a safer distance, buying the legend without paying the original price. But the emotional charge remained in the archive, in the stories, in the faces, in the memory of what racing once was. Ferrari did not invent that darkness. It inherited it and, consciously or not, incorporated it into its identity. If the early racing years forged Ferrari's name, Formula One preserved and amplified it across generations. This continuity is extraordinary. Many great marques have raced. Fewer have remained so tightly identified with a single elite arena for so long, to the point where the team becomes almost inseparable from the sport's own mythology. Ferrari in Formula One is more than a competitor. It is an institution within the institution, an emblem of permanence inside a sport defined by technical change. That permanence matters. In a modern world where brands often chase novelty, Ferrari gained strength from endurance. Fans could attach themselves not only to cars or drivers, but to the idea that Ferrari itself represented an ongoing historical thread. The liveries changed, regulations shifted, heroes came and went, but the red cars remained, carrying memory with them. And again, the myth did not depend on unbroken domination. In fact, periods of frustration often intensified emotional loyalty. Ferrari became a team people could love, resent, mourn, and hope for in cycles. That is the rhythm of serious allegiance. A myth survives not because reality always cooperates, but because people learn to interpret setbacks as part of a larger destiny. Formula One also allowed Ferrari to remain technologically credible. This was essential. A myth built only on nostalgia eventually becomes a museum piece. Ferrari needed to feel alive, dangerous, current. By competing at the highest level, the company could continue claiming that its identity was not only inherited, but renewed under present pressure. This gave Ferrari an unusual balance. It could be historic without seeming obsolete, glamorous without seeming decorative, luxurious without seeming idle. Formula One served as ritual proof that the old legend still had blood in it. No myth remains pure once it becomes globally valuable. Ferrari's history is also the story of how a company manages expansion without dissolving the very rarity that made it desirable in the first place. This is harder than it sounds. Success invites growth. Growth invites dilution. Public companies, investors, global markets, and modern consumers all create pressure for scale, optimization, and broader monetization. Yet Ferrari's power depends precisely on not appearing too available, too rationalized, too democratic. It must grow, but seem above growth. It must earn, but seem uncorrupted by earning. That balancing act has defined much of Ferrari's later history. Product lines expanded. Technology advanced. Customer expectations changed. Safety, regulation, hybridization, and digital systems all reshaped what a modern performance car could be. At the same time, Ferrari had to preserve a sense that each new vehicle still belonged to the same sacred lineage. This is why heritage became so carefully curated. The company did not simply have a past, it staged its past. Museums, archives, anniversary events, design callbacks, racing memory, founder iconography, all of these helped Ferrari maintain continuity while moving through a rapidly changing world. The past became a resource for stabilizing the brand's authority. And yet Ferrari could not become entirely backward-looking. A myth that survives too long on memory becomes parasitic on itself. So the company kept innovating, but framed innovation as service to tradition rather than departure from it. New technologies were absorbed into the old story. Still the same horse, still the same discipline, still the same pursuit of excellence under pressure. This is the genius and the burden of a mythic brand. It cannot simply evolve. Every change must be translated into destiny. At some point, the mechanical details alone can no longer explain the force of Ferrari's image. There have been other fast cars, other successful racing teams, other beautiful machines, other luxury brands with long histories. Yet Ferrari retains a peculiar status. It continues to feel like the reference point, the name that even non-specialists use as shorthand for automotive transcendence. Why? Partly because Ferrari unified so many layers of meaning at once. It had competition credibility, design distinctiveness, founder mythology, national character, symbolic consistency, scarcity, celebrity association, and multi-generational visibility. Most brands have one or two of these. Ferrari accumulated nearly all of them. But there is something else. Ferrari also understood an enduring truth about modern desire. People do not only want the best object, they want an object that carries a story about excellence so total that it seems almost unreasonable. They want to feel that somewhere in the world, despite compromise and mass production and bureaucracy and blandness, there still exists a place where standards are held fanatically high and symbolism is treated seriously. Whether Ferrari always deserves that belief in practical terms is almost beside the point. Myths do not survive because they are literally true in every instance. They survive because they answer an emotional need. Ferrari answers the need to believe that beauty and domination can still occupy the same body, that craftsmanship can still defeat anonymity, that speed can still feel noble, not just efficient, that an object can still command reverence. In that sense, Ferrari is not only selling cars, it is selling resistance to disenchantment. And that may be the deepest lesson in Ferrari's story. We often assume that myths belong to ancient worlds, to kings, wars, religions, and epics. Ferrari reminds us that the modern world creates myths too. It creates them through industry, media, performance, branding, memory, and disciplined repetition. A factory can become a shrine, a logo can become a coat of arms, a machine can become a vessel for collective longing. But the Ferrari story also carries a warning. Myths are powerful because they simplify reality into emotionally legible form. They make institutions seem coherent, inevitable, almost natural. Yet beneath the surface there is always labor, compromise, conflict, fear, strategy, accident, and reinvention. Ferrari was never just born magnificent. It was built through human decisions, under pressure, across decades, by people trying to hold together racing, money, prestige, technology, and identity without letting any one of them destroy the rest. That is why the legend still feels alive, because it is not the story of perfection. It is the story of a system that learned how to transform tension into aura. And perhaps that is what people sense when they hear the name Ferrari. Not merely wealth, not merely speed, but the feeling that somewhere inside the machine is an argument about modern civilization itself, about whether beauty can survive industry, whether prestige can survive commerce, whether a symbol can survive success. Most companies make products, a few make reputations. Ferrari did something rarer. It made belief. And belief, once built well enough, can outlast the noise of history. It can survive changing technology, changing markets, changing generations. It can keep riding forward, bright and improbable, like a red car disappearing into the distance, part machine, part memory, part promise, and part illusion. Which is to say, like all the most durable myths, something human beings created because they needed to feel that some things were still allowed to be more than useful.